Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, what I'd like to do today is cover the SAB in England and what we know up to date. Just a little bit of background on myself, and I'll be quite quick. I sort of look at drainage and flood risk within WSP, but in particular, I've been part of a steering group and training team that delivers training to the water companies on the use of SuDS within the DCG, which is the document that replaced SuDS for adoption back in 2020. So what we're talking about today is the Flood and Water Management Act, and in particular Schedule 3 as it may apply to England. I want to give you a little bit of a broad background to that. But first, I'd like to ask a question, which is, how many of the 260 odd people listening to this webinar, how many of you have actually heard of the proposed implementation of Schedule 3 in England? I wonder if you could, I can't actually see the results. We should have a yes/no question flashed up on your screen. Okay, would it be possible to see the results? So actually, that's quite a positive result, because I did ask the question a couple of weeks ago of another audience, and it was completely the other way around. So that's quite interesting. Thanks for that. So what I'm going to try and cover today with the help of some colleagues, and in particular Ian Titherington, is where we've got to, how it's come apart or come to be this year as opposed to other years, but also some background as to what's the difference between guidance and regulation and why it's quite a complicated process. And then we'll finish off with a brief summary of where we think the Schedule 3 will be, or what it might look like, but also try and leave some time at the end for some questions. And there's a Q&A function within the Zoom link. So if there are any questions that you've got as we go through, put them in there, and the guys in the background will answer them if they can, or we'll raise them at the end. So thank you very much. So background. Why is it all of a sudden come to the fore? So in January, the government made a statement, and I've quoted one of the government ministers, Rebecca Powell, said our traditional drainage systems are under increasing pressure from the effects of climate change, urbanisation and growing population. The benefits of sustainable drainage systems are many, from mitigating flood risk by catching and storing surplus water and reducing storm overflow discharges, to enhancing local nature in the heart of our developments and helping with harvesting valuable rainfall. So this is a kind of a sort of a statement as to the intent. And the result of that was that in January 10th this year, a report was published by the government stating that they will now look at the implementation of Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act in England. And it has stated at the time that the new approach is expected to come into force in 2024. So that literally sort of 6 months away from now. As a brief background, and as where the Flood and Water Management Act came from and its sort of history, it is quite a long history that goes back to the Water Framework Directive of 2000, but it really came out of the pit review in 2008 that followed the quite severe flooding that we had in many parts of the country. And it was one of the direct results of the pit review and its many recommendations, and became an act really very rapidly. So, and it changed some of the structure. So lead local flood authorities became into existence and various other things. But Schedule 3 was part of that. but it didn't come into force. Then more recently than that, Schedule 3 was enacted in Wales, sort of a simpler structure, fewer water companies, fewer stakeholders. So probably a good testing bed for it. But what it meant is that gap between the Flood and Water Management Act and the SAB in Wales meant that there were gaps in the implementation of SuDS. There was a lot of voices saying that SuDS are the solution or part of the solution to a lot of flooding and drainage issues. But how do you get that taken up by development, by retrofitting, etc.? How do you get that in place? So one of the mechanisms that came out of that sort of vacuum was replacing SuDS for adoption with what is now the design and construction guidance, and also changing the status of that document to make that mandatory. So if you're familiar with the design and construction guidance, it is a very SuDS heavy guide in terms of surface water, but that in itself refers to a non-statutory document called the SuDS manual. Rather than repeating large sections of it, it refers to that guidance. So now we're looking at that, filling that void with a SAB in England. Now we have the example in Wales. So, as I said, it became an act quite quickly, and established the lead local flood authorities, but it hasn't completely fully come into being. But one of the key elements of it is this word partnerships between all of the flooding authorities and elements that are needed to control or maintain flood risk. And that partnership is key to what's coming with the SAB. So local authorities, as part of that partnership, we're looking at setting up these sort of agreements between other bodies, internal drainage boards, the Environment Agency, water companies, and look at developing the SAB, which is the SuDS Approving Body. So as such, it hasn't happened in England. LLFAs were originally funded to establish themselves. And I think most people probably listening to this webinar are very familiar with the lead local flood authority and how that has changed some aspects of surface water management. On the other side of the fence, we have developers who are encouraged to use SuDS in new developments, but it's not completely mandatory in many aspects. And that's really where the SAB is trying to fill those gaps. And that is where we have this shift in responsibility from water companies towards the local authority as a SAB being the body that adopts and maintains surface water assets. So this is a different process and a different way of looking at new developments in particular. It's not a retrospective thing at the moment. So why all of a sudden now? And I don't know if you've kept an eye on the sort of industry at the moment, there's been a lot of publications coming out over the last year or so, including the SuDS guidance, but also the new update of the manual for streets is going to have more of an emphasis on using SuDS within street and urban realm. We've got reports on reducing the risk of surface water flooding. We've got key reports in particular on stormwater overflows and CSOs, which again refers to SuDS being one of the options that could help reduce that incident. So there's a lot of elements that are all coming together to suggest that sustainable drainage and its implementation has a wide-ranging benefits across the industry. So what actually is Schedule 3? So it's been under review recently since 2021, and that's when the government announcement in January came out that they will be accepting the recommendation that it should be implemented. So The idea is that it then ties in with other documents like the National Planning Policy Framework, which has been rewritten and updated periodically, and more recently, it is now getting a bit more firmer, a bit more deliberate in its use of words, saying that you should be incorporating sustainable drainage unless there's clear evidence that it's not appropriate. So that has kind of pushed it forward. We've been involved in a lot of Schedule 3 work in the past, and certainly more recently we're working with DEFRA in looking at how the implementation is actually going to work. And some of the things I'll talk about in a minute will be some of those key tasks and processes that need to be looked at to bring forward Schedule 3, because it's not just a case of saying, yes, we'll do it. There's a lot going on in the background, and Ian may be able to run through a few of those from the Welsh experience as to some of the pitfalls, some of the advantages going through. So what we're looking at is something that's going to come forward towards next year, and part of the work that we've been doing at the moment is looking at that skills gap, looking at that capacity review, as it's often called, as to what's needed, what needs to change and be included to bring forward Schedule 3. And that includes a lot of stakeholders from both sides, the local authority side, from the water company side, from the developer side, from the planning system side. What are their interests? What are their drivers? How is that all going to be coordinated? And in particular, the training side of bringing a SAB to the 151 legal local flood authorities that there are in England. It's not a small task, it's a big task. So part of this is that any SuDS delivery process is going to have many, many moving parts and many stakeholders, and it's not as simple as a pipe from manhole 1 to manhole 2. There's a lot of things that get wrapped up into the Schedule 3 and the SuDS approach to drainage, and this includes management of everyday rainfall as well as extreme rainfall. And a lot of the guidance and mandatory regulation at the moment is geared around extreme rainfall events, but is also the management of everyday rainfall events, which is key to looking at other aspects such as biodiversity, amenity, water quality in particular. So those aspects being brought into legislation will have a lot of key benefits. So just as a small little aside is the difference between standards and regulation, because there is some confusion in this, and in certain circumstances there are differences. So SuDS for adoption, for instance, some of you may be aware that you would have designed you had the choice of versions 5, 6 or 7, and sometimes in parallel, but they were actually only code to practice guidance type regulation. They were not strictly speaking enforceable, although they sort of de facto enforceable, whereas the design and construction guidance is actually now the mandatory adoption standard. So it has a different level of background to it and enforceability. So we have acts like the Flood and Water Management Act, and that's backed up by policy. So we have national planning policy and with local plans and core strategies, and then which are all the ones that are the ones that can be legally challenged, legally enforced. And then you get regulations, which are supplementary to both of those. And in most cases, they are taken to be enforceable, but some of them may not necessarily be. And then you've got a lot of the guidance, like the policy practice guidance within the NPPF. You've got other standards. So the SuDS manual, for instance, everybody uses that for SuDS, but it is not a statutory document. It is just guidance. Making it a statutory document is a quite complex piece of legislation. More in keeping with that guidance is things like the building regs documents. which have a bit more standing. And then you have British standards, design and manual for roads and bridges, those kind of things. And then in the background to all of those are guidance that sort of explains how each one of these could be used and applied. So an example of this would be when we're looking at drainage discharge hierarchy, for instance. It is described in many different documents in slightly different ways, and it's knowing where these are and where these are statutory and where these are just guidance. So it's worth being aware of a lot of different documents and not just stick with the one. So we have British standards for drainage, which has the hierarchy listed. Building regs has it. There's documents in the background. So this is a historic document devised by the local authority organisation, which tried to define how the technical standards are applied in a consistent manner. So some of this goes beyond the non-statutory technical standards, but is worth knowing about in the background because these things all form a narrative towards where we're going now. So the current standards, if you are aware, there's 14 standards within the non-statutory technical standard for SuDS, which is the sort of official document. But again, it's not statutory. And for those who have flicked through its pages, I know it's quite a skeleton of a document, and there's not much in the way of details. The 14 standards only tackle some aspects of drainage and flood risk management. So flood risk outside the development, peak flow control, volume control, flood risk within the development, and then the sort of functional aspects of structural integrity, maintenance and construction. And those are basically the 14 standards. But because, as I say, the document was kind of a skeleton framework, it needed to be explained. So the LASU document, Local Authority SuDS Officers Organisation, prepared a guidance note to try and explain how to apply each of those standards in a practical manner. And this is definitely a document worth knowing about and referencing, because the elements within this are very likely to come forward in some form towards the SAB. So what I was saying earlier is that the non-statutory technical standards only apply some of the SuDS principles, and basically those principles are around water quantity. They don't really cover much in the way of quality, and they definitely don't cover amenity or biodiversity, which are all these parts of the 4 pillars of SuDS. So what we need now is to start expanding the definition of the technical standards to include and introduce all of those factors, particularly water quality, because that's the one that is currently rising to the top of the list. But amenity and biodiversity should not be discounted. So I'm going to briefly hand over to Ian, if that's okay, who, as I said before, has worked in Welsh Government from the local authority side to the national side. We'll be able to go through a little bit about where the experience in Wales has come from. But before we do that, I'm just curious how many people within the audience may have had experience in Wales. An interesting question. And remember, if you've got any questions throughout the presentation, hit the Q&A tab and enter them in. So what have we got as a result? Barbara? So not very many. It looks like about 34 out of the respondents have experience in Wales. Okay, so Ian, do you want to take it away?
Thanks so much. Thanks for that, Chris. It was a good build-up. Don't know if I can match that. Thanks for everyone inviting me along this afternoon. Prior to my role as a senior SuDS advisor for Welsh Government, I was had the joys of delivering Schedule 3 Flood and Water Management Act in Cardiff. I was a SAB officer there for 4.5 years. Even though the document's 2018, it didn't start till 7 a.m. January the 7th, 2019. Well, I keep telling you, the last time I had a social life. That's when it all kicked in. And it's been an interesting ride. It has to be said. The difference between statutory and non-statutory is not relying on the goodwill of the developer, not to value engineer out sustainable drainage, which is what I always got as a drainage engineer in the council prior to statutory legislation. So it is a massive change. It is a lot of work, but the good news is it works. And although it's been difficult to deliver because of resources and the issues we'll discuss now in the next 10 minutes or so, it does work as a principle. Anything over 100 square meters within a red line development boundary where the runoff characteristics of that 100 square meter plus change, generally in a detrimental way, that's when the SAB kicks in and you require SAB approval or you don't build. It's very Puritan legislation. It's a technical appeal. It's not easy to appeal against. So it's quite strong legislation. So people don't get SAB, they don't build. Separate from planning as well, independent from planning. Talking about the role of the SAB, early engagement, as with all good drainage design, early engagement is critical. The joy of this legislation, it basically enforces early engagement, making a place, designing for surface water before the other statutory services for that site. It's a very, very important message. Looking at constraints and opportunities at an early stage. I'm very, very keen to encourage pre-application discussions and meetings. You can get a viability check on the 6 standards as we have in Wales. I think there'll be 7 in England, I anticipate. Get a viability check on those standards before you move ahead with the main design or put a planning application in. So important to have those early conversations. You get a better design and you keep your costs down. That's why it's important. Treatment trains, the big difference in the legislation is quality, source control and quality of the water runoff. Predominantly that's aimed at highway runoff. 95% of the pollutant off any new development is parking areas and highway areas. So those are the areas where you concentrate generally the bioretention systems to try and manage the pollutant flow. Obviously, what you do with SuDS is multi-benefits. You try and put a SuDS feature in that does more than one thing. So you're trying to get multi-benefits out of the maximum area, which enables the developer to get the development density they want and the surface water management that you want. Maintenance and operation, very, very important to design for low maintenance, infrequent maintenance and easy access. Those thoughts have to be there at the beginning of the design. Single body responsible for surface water. Well, more or less. You still got the water companies, you still got the regulatory bodies, but there's certainly a greater responsibility in local government with the LLFA and the SAB role. And there is a mandatory adoption for SuDS. When two curtilages come together, there is a mandatory adoption option for the SAB. Early discussions, as I mentioned, incentive to identify true density and viability of the site. If a site's too dense, then it shouldn't be built anyway under current regulations. But basically, as a SAB, if you can't get the 6 standards, you don't build, and there's no way around that for the developer. Which is so important to have those relationships between the local planning authority and the highways engineers as well. You run independently of both, but you run parallel between the two and have constant conversations. And I say consideration of a site through a proportionate and reasonable approach to development. We should be doing that already, but what the SAB does is ensures it happens. Right, next page, please. Sorry about the background noise in my computer. Other guidance, technical guidance, TAN 15. That's about to change in Wales. It's currently up for discussion and debate. We have 2 statutory consultees, the Water Company and Natural Resources Wales, which is a Welsh version of the Environment Agency. But obviously, flood risk management as part of the SAB is very, very important. Welsh Government guidance, statutory standards, again, we're dealing with that. Local authority surface water management standards, yes, those are influential, but I think the SAB often supersedes some of these situations. Building regulations generally relating to where soakaways are located. We use the BRE 365 soakaway test. It's not brilliant, but it's the best available. Sewers for adoption. Again, if it's to be adopted by the water company, yes, it's a good design guide for surface water drainage, but I wouldn't say necessarily it rules the roost. The planning policy Wales, again, relevant, but this legislation is quite powerful. It's quite strong, and you get what you want as a SAB officer. If you want the best design and you want design let, you get what you want. You work with planners, you work with highways, but you have to insist on the best feasible design for your standards. Again, you're referring to foul sewers, which come under planning rather than SAB. You do connect into combined sewers at times, but it's the choice of last resort. Following the SuDS hierarchy, it's the very choice of last resort. And then you do have the powers to do that. Automatic right to connection are gone under our legislation, but it's very, very important to be careful how you use those powers as a SAB. Work very closely with the Water Authority. Rainscape, Dorcombe Welsh Water have a Rainscape policy. They're currently employing new officers to work with local authorities to come up with partnership SuDS designs as part of some of the solutions under the DWMP. So we're hoping to move forward with that with their Rainscape, which was pioneered internationally about 10 or 12 years ago. So all these documents and bodies are important, but what holds it together is the SuDS legislation. Last week, on Thursday, I do remember it well, we've finally got the SuDS review. After 2 years, we were hoping to do a full review of our legislation. Obviously, COVID kicked in, so we were delayed. But Arup worked closely with us for 12 months and published this document, which is on the free link to have a look at. 76 recommendations, the last time I remember. Obviously, the minister has to decide on the priorities and which ones the minister's happy with. But what we're trying to do under these 17, under 4 groups, 17 key areas, we're trying to improve the legislation through viable means. What I mean by that is I'm not going to insist that our 22 unitary authority SABs commit huge expenditure to deliver better services. That's not viable because in terms of local government, the resources are not there. So what we want to do is to ask to make changes in terms of the systems, in terms of the applications, clarity. One good example is we're going to be proposing and we're going to be tendering for a commuted sums calculator for developers, so they know upfront what commuted sums are going to cost as part of their development. Little ideas like that in terms of making it easier and clearer for applicants and for SABs to make the system work. As you say, these are lots of lessons that England doesn't have to learn the hard way. They can learn from Wales. Again, listing some of the issues. We don't have enough training, very similar to England. There's a skills gap. We need to work very hard on this. I want to have a sort of a status pack for SAB officers in local authorities, so there's more consistency. We do lose a lot of officers. There's a real turnover in local government. It's very important, perhaps, to regionalise specialisms. Not every local authority is going to employ an ecologist, so it's important to have that knowledge kept in local government, although there is a reliance on specialist consultants to deliver a lot of these services as well, where there are gaps. It's so important that we train up, and it's particularly the work WSP are doing with SIWAM. It's almost like, how would I describe it? There's a 2-stage process going on here. There's a sticking plaster process, which is to get enough people ready for towards the end of next year, when hopefully England has Schedule 3. And we need a longer workforce plan for sustainable drainage, for climate change management. It's not there at the moment, and the industry needs to react and have a longer workforce plan, specifically in managing the climate crisis in our part of engineering. At the moment, that's not happening. That's another job for WSP and Chris, perhaps. But certainly, these are the areas that we need to develop, and this is the first thing I tipped off our friends in DEFRA on as soon as we were asked to consult, and when England chose Schedule 3. So really, that's a key factor. And the partnership that Chris referred to earlier, having those relationships between the water authorities and the SABs is very important. With the EA involvement is very important, and the public and private sector as well. Having that conversation about what works and what doesn't, designs that work and designs that don't. It's very important to share best practice, lessons learned. The pre-SAB applications, there is no time frame. That's a problem. We need to preset that so things don't drag on too long. But also, it's very, very important to have a pre-application system, because that flags up very early if there's a fundamental problem in your design. What you don't want to do is go to full planning application before you've had a check in your SAB. If you do that, you're in trouble. So that's a really, really important message. The period of 7 weeks, it's a little short. So I'm getting lots of emails in from people. It's a little short. Normally the water company responds within 4 weeks. It's very, very good, but you need time sometimes with large hydraulic models to check. You need more time on larger developments, or if groundwater testing is required. All these elements need to be thought about in terms of infiltration to understand the viability of the time period. It can be extended by mutual agreement, but you know, it's important to once the designs are done, to get the ball rolling on the SAB application. Requirements being enforced on retrofit, regeneration, brownfield sites. I think brownfield sites, we allowed a reduction of the amount of water we were stopping and letting off site. To be honest, no, we're probably going to be moving away from that. Brownfield site be treated as anywhere else, because generally a brownfield site, it's a dilapidated site anyway, so the system's not working. So any system you're tapping into shouldn't be based on its original capacity. It should be based on its current conditions. So I think there are limitations about what we can give in flexibility in terms of brownfield sites. Next page. Yeah, they try and avoid it by going under 100 square meters. Generally, you know, when you start getting sites smaller than that, it's very hard to meet the 6 standards anyway, because it's quite finicky in terms of the area. So generally, I think people aren't too scared off by the situation now. In many ways, it's easier to use the SAB system than to use the planning system with conditions. Something that England will find when the legislation came in, there was a rush of applications to come in a few weeks before the SuDS legislation kicked in. And I mean, a lot of housing developments with thousands of houses, they thought it was advantageous for them to avoid the SuDS legislation and do pre-SuDS legislation. It wasn't actually. What's happened, ironically, is some SAB applications have overtaken the ones that were put in beforehand because of the complications of doing drainage conditions outside SAB. Actually, the SAB system, if it's used properly, it's actually quicker and not slower than doing it through standard drainage conditions. So it's a bit of an urban myth about SABs necessarily slowing everything down. If it's a good application, it should fly through. If it's a bad application, it won't fly through. As simple as that, because if we don't like it, we'll stop it. As you say, I think Chris is probably going to take over from me now in terms of what's going on in England. We are working very closely with our colleagues in DEFRA in order to help them set up the structure and system. It's fairly similar to the Welsh legislation, with some suggested changes that we put forward, and also some of the different structures in England that would enable them to have hopefully a smoother running legislation. There'll be questions and answers at the end, but that's my bit for now. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. That really, really useful. And as I say, and as Ian alluded to, the review is basically not an independent review that ignores what's gone before. It's using the information from the Welsh experience to help structure and inform a way forward. And it is to do with this effectiveness to reduce the impact of flooding and reduce the impact of water quality problems, but do it in a structured way that makes sure that it happens far more than sort of the ad hoc way that it does at the moment. So at the moment, it is looking like in England, it's going to be in a similar model. It's going to be an extension of the authority and processes of local authorities in terms of lead local flood authorities are most likely to take on that roles. There might be some nuances in certain areas where resources need other facilities and companies to bridge some of the gaps, but we will be looking at a completely SuDS orientated way of surface water management. So that's not only the quantity that we were talking about before, but quality, amenity and biodiversity. And particularly, many of you have probably heard the term biodiversity net gain flying around in the background. So there is that aspect which a lot of SuDS features actually intrinsically can help with, as well as not being, a standalone aspect of the development. Try and incorporate that multifunction bits. So at the moment, as sort of mentioned by Ian as well, we have these standards. So currently there's 14 standards, and said before they're mainly around quantity. The work that's going on in the background at the moment with DEFRA and various other bodies is a review of the standards, and 6 main standards are going to be updated, and those are ones sort of shown on the right hand side. So runoff destinations, so this runoff hierarchy is going to be more emphasis on that within the documents. There's going to be a new standard on what's called everyday rainfall. And so, as I said before, everyday rainfall has much bigger impact on controlling water quality than the flash flood peak, 1 in 100, etc. with climate change. If you can manage the everyday rainfall, you will reduce the loading on water treatment works. You'll reduce the loading on CSOs. You'll improve the water quality from all your destinations. And then modifying standards for extreme rainfall, make that a bit clearer, a bit more consistency in that, but introduce standards on water quality, amenity and biodiversity. And certainly the latter two are going to be those ones that are going to be maybe for pure engineers a little bit harder to try and pin down and explain in a suitable way that can be applied to a drainage process. So what we're looking at is, again, there's still, the mention of projects larger than 100 square meters. And if you bear in mind that at the moment, a lead local flood authority may not be consulted on anything less than 1,000 square meters or a hectare or 10 houses, that is a massive step change in the number of applications being reviewed and the level of detail that they're being reviewed at. As said a few times today, the SAB approval is essential before you build. If you don't have that approval, you will not be allowed to build, and it sits outside and parallel to the planning process. These SuDS and adopted features sort of kick off with 2 or more dwellings, units, whatever, but they need to be accessible. They need to be similar to adopted sewers. They need to be able to be accessed and maintained. There is going to be a review of how permitted development rights and Section 278 agreements, etc., are going to function within this process. And it is thought that a lot of highway schemes and modifications that fall outside of planning will be brought into the SAB process. So there's additional controls on those kind of developments that are currently not being caught with the process at the moment. In terms of implementation, it's mentioned before 2024. That is a target date, and there's a lot of work to go on in the background. There's a lot of legislation that actually physically has to be amended and ratified, as well as the functional stuff as in terms of resourcing and designing the standards, etc. So it may be that there is also a grace period where developments that are already in the planning system don't have to be entirely revisited. So there may overlap with the implementation of the SAB. So, as I said, the main key thing working in the background is this rewrite of the design standards. I think I've discussed most of those at the moment. So the other standards will still be in there, the construction, the maintenance, those ones, but these additional ones of everyday rainfall destinations, water quality, biodiversity, and amenity will be new aspects to it. The actual process is likely to be very similar to the Welsh process. So as Ian was alluding to, the pre-app submission, the pre-app consultation is vital in streamlining the whole process. And then you have to get this consent, which revolves around the SAB submission, similar to a submission that you would do to a water company. But the difference being in that the SAB would then take on the operation and maintenance of that water system. And it may then interact with a water company downstream, but that part of it is outside of the process. And the adoption and maintenance becomes a key aspect right at the beginning of any application. So this brings the whole of drainage right up the importance of any master planning process. So it's not a case of here's a master plan, fit some drainage into it. This really does bring it to the fore where it can influence and should influence parts of the master planning. And the SAB being part of that partnership alongside the designers would help ensure that whatever's approved at planning then makes it through the whole stages through to development and then maintenance and operation. And so there's a few kind of key summaries in there. There is this need for greater standards of SuDS. It's got to be clearer to everybody involved in it, from the SAB officers through to the planners, through to the designers and the developers, that the standards are being met and they're being met consistently. And as I said, there's 151 lead local flood authorities. That's potentially 151 different ways of doing things. It needs to be standardized. But that means more information on things like commuted sums, on things like design standards of inlets and outlets, and maintenance of the landscaping regime, all of those things. And that in turn needs larger teams within the consultancy side of it and within the SAB side of it, because they are now dealing not just with the numbers of in terms of cubic meters of storage, but you're dealing with flow rates, you're dealing with what happens in a drought situation, what soils are you using, or engineered soils, planting, landscaping, public access, all of those kind of things are going to be melded into the same process. So all of those sort of things are envisaged to come through. Now, that is generally the end of the talking bit of it. And we have a third question which has been run in the background, but also we have this Q&A side of things, and it's just to gather a few thoughts on what you would consider the advantage and disadvantages of introducing Schedule 3 into England. It'd be just interesting to find out from you guys what you feel about that. So I think there are some elements in the chat already. So if I come out of the presentation, I think we can look at the chat.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ian. That's really useful. Thank you. I've got quite a few questions. So do we know if there'll be any changes to what happens in Scotland, please? Is this just implementation for the UK? Oh, sorry, England.
It is purely an English implementation. Yeah, it doesn't change anything in Scotland.
Thank you. Another question, is there a distinction being made between development boundary line and catchment areas, for example, to exclude significant green space and landscaped areas that are not part of the proposed sustainable drainage?
Yeah, I think Ian alluded to other schemes amending red lines to try and suit the application boundary, but it'll be similar, I would think, to the way that biodiversity net gain is being looked at, in that you can't exclude that from your development. Otherwise, you wouldn't have achieved your biodiversity net gain. So, as with any planning application, in terms, you do need to include all the elements that make that application work. So simply excluding the green space, I don't think is going to work on any level, biodiversity net gain level or drainage or SuDS level.
Thank you. This is a question to Ian. Oh, hold on, screen's just jumped. How would the LLFAs in Wales view the sustainability of SuDS schemes with fully pumped outfalls? Easy for me to say.
Don't like them. Don't want them. Sorry, I'm a bit vague here. No, you're building in a risk factor then if it's a failure on the system. Generally, SABs don't approve of them. We don't necessarily have the very, very low-lying areas that parts of England have, as we've got greater fall on the topography, but generally, no, because you're building in a risk factor, a maintenance factor that's a high risk, so you shouldn't be building high risk maintenance into your systems. Occasionally, you'll have a low level area where you'll have a low level pump that if it failed, the overflow wouldn't cause any flooding to any properties through its exceedance flow path. But you've got to consider the exceedance flow path. You've got to consider what floods of the risk there is from the exceedance flow path from your site in your system. And generally a surface water pumping system, if that failed, would create problems. So generally that wouldn't be allowed. There are a few exceptions, but to my knowledge, very few.
Thank you, Ian. A concern that's been raised, and is my concern as well, frankly, how are we going to resource this at a local authority level? There'll be some help from national to help develop, and recruits. But will there be training courses, programs, apprenticeships, just to help us face the coming storm?
Yeah, I mean, that is part of what's being looked at the moment. There's a report that we've been working on with DEFRA outlining that, and it's similar to the experience I had with the water companies, in that you suddenly go from a network that is very numerical, manholes linked to more manholes with a chamber at the end or whatever. Now you're introducing other factors. And yes, there's an element of training. So the water companies have sort of been going through that the last couple of years, and it needs to be extended across, because it's not only going to be the SABs that need the training, it's going to be the developers and the planners and a lot of people. Yes, it is one of the issues. I don't have an answer, a magic wand to solve that.
I don't think there is an answer for that. It's going to be, as Ian alluded to earlier, it's quite a constrained industry. There's, it's quite there will not be enough people to help fulfill this role.
Yeah, so it's a good time to be a drainage engineer, probably.
Another question, if we may, how does the SAB ensure that the SuDS are not prioritised over equally important disciplines, i.e. ecology, landscape, heritage, highways? I don't know if Ian has any comments on that.
I think I found that actually it's helped my colleagues, my previous colleagues in other departments, whereas they would be a statutory consultee, but under the planning conditions, their opinions would be listened to, but not necessarily adhered to. Under the SAB legislation, if they came under my umbrella as a SAB officer, the developer does what I tell them. So if there was an issue about biodiversity loss as part of a development, and I raised that as part of the amenity and biodiversity under the standards, they'd have to meet those standards. So in many ways, it's advantageous. I wouldn't say it was detrimental. I would say because of the way the legislation is written, it's beneficial to biodiversity amenity. In terms of highways, as I mentioned earlier, it's so important to work with planners and highway engineers. You don't want to come up with a design that's hard to maintain. It causes pathway problems for bus routes. You've got to come up with a design that works with your highway colleagues. That's about having early conversations with highways about what designs you want. They need to understand it's statutory, and you need to understand they want safe and manageable systems. And generally, I had very little pushback, actually, particularly the younger engineers coming through, much more open-minded to change. Their attitude is now, this is the new norm, let's do it. And that's the attitude you need with this legislation.
No, thank you. Some others are also looking at the advantages of this, increasing multiple benefits, SuDS, the security of long-term maintenance, land put aside for flood risk management. Yeah, so there are many advantages to this, but as you alluded, yeah.
I make one comment is it was almost tempting to get your own back time, because I've been decades as a drainage engineer in local government, usually patronised, frequently ignored, comments made, you know, your comments are noted, we're going to build this anyway and do what we want. It was almost tempting the first week back, sit there with my new council tie on, say, right, it's payback time now, all this nonsense have I put up with. You do feel like that when you've been there a long time and been ignored. But no, the sense of responsibility kicks in. I got this new role. You know what a difference you can make if you do it properly, and then you learn so much about trees, about vegetation, about pollution, about how to manage microplastics, about flow, things I thought I knew about, I knew nothing about. You tend to expand your knowledge in different areas, and then start respecting different areas of expertise. So it actually, I think, brings a lot of roles together to come up with a better solution. You know, I can only describe it as in local and national government, all the funding paths are vertical, the siloed funding paths. You do a multi-benefit scheme like SuDS, it's horizontal. So you tap into everyone rather than just having one line. You have many lines, and you end up with better design, and that's what it's all about, better design.
I think I'm just going through some of the questions that have been asked. I think probably that does go into the one quite good question that's been asked is, do we or should we consider whole life carbon reduction in part of the submissions? And as a result, does that encourage the use of blue-green systems? And I would think that it does certainly open that a whole panacea of options to have a more holistic and more self-sustaining system. So I think that will be the way forward for these things.
Yeah, and I have something I'd add to it. In working in the water sector at the moment, all the new pollutants we're learning about almost on a monthly basis, in terms of chemicals, forever chemicals, obviously the nutrient neutrality, phosphates and nitrates. You know, a clever treatment train manages and captures so many of the pollutants we're only just discovering, and because of the way these systems are designed, they're remarkably tolerant to quite toxic levels of pollutants within the soil, within the systems. The plants are very tolerant to them, and they don't just slow the flow, they catch the pollutants. I always use a rude word there instead because it rhymed, but they are very clever systems, and when you design them, install them correctly, what we're looking at, we're only just into the research now, they tend to be outperforming what we thought they do. They seem to be holding the water more and catching more pollutants than we thought they would. It's quite interesting in terms of research. We're learning an awful lot about well designed and when installed and when maintained. Those three things need to be important. They do work remarkably well in terms, I know in the Greater Green in Sheffield, they wondered where all the water went. They couldn't get any water out the outlet of the rain gardens. Even when it rained heavily, they wouldn't come out the other end, because it was such an effective system in terms of what they did with the water. So it is, you know, research is only just happening now, but in a few years' time, I think some of the research will be quite exciting about what these systems do beyond what we thought they could do.
Yeah, I think there's some research going on with Wessex Water, where they found that their constructed wetlands can take up nearly 99% of any dissolved plastic, well, not dissolved plastic, but microplastics. You know, a natural benefit of the filtration of a wetland, you collect the microplastics. It was probably never designed to do that, but it just manages to do it. There's quite a lot of questions that I think we could answer enough. I think we've reached the end of our time slot, haven't we? Is there a way we can answer these offline?
Yes, or you can carry on for a couple more minutes if you like.
Yeah, there was one question about the implementation date of 2024. I don't know if Catherine can actually expand on that, but my understanding is that there is no fixed date yet for the implementation. It's a case of watching this space, I think.
So there's no fixed date as yet. There should be a consultation coming out soon on the 6 statutory instruments, which I would recommend when it comes out, everyone to feedback in to. And then following this, they should be giving a date following the outcome of that consultation. The consultation is on how it's implemented, not if it's to be implemented. So yeah, that should be coming out. They said summer. We're in June. I'm not too sure. So yeah, that should be coming out soon. And then a lot of these questions I think will be able to be answered following that consultation coming through. So we're still at the early stages, but it's still looking at the 2024 implementation.
Excellent, thank you. That would probably go a way to answer questions like minimum discharge rates. I think there's a specific question for you, Ian, about how that's progressed.
Okay, I think England might be taking a slightly different direction from us on that, but generally there's a slight variation on the definition of a greenfield runoff rate on a development site, where some developers have been using UK SuDS and some developers have been using the SuDS manual.
Oh, I think we may have lost Ian. Yeah, I think we've lost Ian. But yes, I think what he was trying to say, the methods for calculating greenfield runoff rate and flows is still sort of got several different interpretations, and that will be part of the development of the statutory instruments, is to try and hone that down into a more consistent approach. And that includes what would be minimum discharge rates. I mean, it was one thing that came out of the design and construction guidance, is that you've now got 100 millimeters where you do not have any kind of pre-filter, and then 50 millimeters where you have some kind of filtering process, a SuDS feature, for instance. So those things come out of it. So just reading the there's a lot in here that I think it would be useful to perhaps follow up if we can later, and some useful statements that people have made. So I think thank you. Oh.
Apologies for that, my system cut out. I do apologize.
That's okay.
What I was going to say on outflow rates is I think greenfield runoff rate is a critical factor, and one of the issues we did run into with small SABs and large developments and have the ability to verify the modeling that they're getting. Some of the very large hydraulic models are quite complicated, and there can be anomalies in those models, and having the ability to look for those anomalies is important for SABs, particularly the smaller ones. So that is something that we flagged up with our friends in DEFRA to ensure that the modeling anomalies are verified before anything goes ahead. And because not every SAB's going to have the ability to run and understand full simulation models on large housing developments. And I think there needs to be a bit of technical support in certain areas.
Yes, I think we'll call it a day.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see if we can. Thank you. We'll
Yep.
see if we can answer some of the questions. Take that offline. Just wanted to thank Ian, Chris, Catherine, and all of the SOA West Midlands branch for their support today, and Barbara in the background. Thank you so much. Appreciated. We'll see if we can take the questions offline. But thank you to all the attendees today, speakers. for attending this webinar. We hope you found it informative and will join us again. Further details on our events can be found on the Simon events page, and that includes past recordings of the digital series and can also be found on YouTube. Thank you to all. Look after yourselves and hope to see you all again. Thank you.
Thank you.